Hello and welcome. I'm Patrick Curtis, your host and chief monkey, and this is the Wall Street Oasis Podcast. Join me as I talk to some of the community's most successful and inspirational members to gain valuable insight into different career paths and life in general. Let's get to it. In this episode, Chris shares his path from the University of Zurich to working in Citi's London office for 14 years. Listen to hear his recruiting advice, what it was like when the great financial crisis hit when he was an analyst in 2008, what that meant to his future, how his roles and pay shifted as he got promoted, as well as some do's and don'ts while networking. Enjoy. Chris, thanks so much for joining the Wall Street Oasis podcast.
Hi, Patrick. Good to speak to you today.
So it'd be awesome if you could give the listeners a short summary bio.
Sure. My name's Christopher Wickley. I was a director at Citi after 14 years of experience at Citigroup in equity capital markets, covering Northern Europe. Prior to that, I also worked and studied. At the same time, I finished my degrees at the University of Zurich in Switzerland in 2007, joined directly Citi in the grad program. And next to my studies, I was working at a firm called Kepler Equities, which came out of Julius Baer, a Swiss private bank, in the brokerage division and in brokerage and equity research. Basically, to this day today, I just left Citi. An opportunity to speak a bit about the industry for you guys and maybe give a bit some insights into what a career in investment banking means.
For sure. I really appreciate you taking the time. So let's go all the way back to the University of Zurich. And are you from Zurich or from the area? And was finance ever on the radar? Because I know you're a political science, history, archaeology major, which is very different. So tell me how you ended up at Citi first and kind of just a little bit more about your background growing up.
Sure. Look, Patrick, I think it's yes, I think so. I'm Swiss, but spent a number of years abroad growing up. That's why you most probably won't discern much of an accent in my English. But internationality was always quite important for me. And second thing for me, I think also important was I grew up at home. My dad was a banker. For a number of years internationally too, and then back in Switzerland. So I was very familiar through friends, family, surroundings with the financial world. Obviously, as a Swiss, private banking is a big industry, and definitely felt that was the way I was going to head at some point. My first experience was at Julius Baer back in 2001. Where I finished my high school called Gymnasium, did my maturation or matura, and headed to work at Julius Baer, first in payments and transaction services, then working on a cash desk, again, all organized directly with Julius Baer. And then I was transferred into one of the private banking teams to work on their desk as an assistant, all pre-studies. Gave me great overview. I felt, this is the way to go, and loved it. I love the financial industry because of the internationality. Clients were all Asia, Far Eastern, US clients back then. And yeah, there were some good experiences there that also showed to me that I did enjoy the world. And, private banking is a lot, and I know there's an investment banking podcast, but just to touch on it.
It's fine. We talk about all finance careers, so this is good.
Oh, very good. Well, private banking in Swiss obviously is such a long tradition, but there's a big service mentality behind it. And
tell me about that. We haven't had a podcast, talking about private banking. I don't think we know a lot. Obviously, I don't know much about Julius Baer. I'd love to hear more about that, and just specifically, it sounds like you were doing kind of internships after high school or during high school?
After high school, before university, correct.
University, so great. Yeah. Can you tell me about that? And was it just through family connections that you landed it, or how did you get that?
No, that was purely applied directly into different HR departments. I was always just very interested in getting ones to work. Obviously, 18, you finish your high school, you want to do something, and banking was definitely going to be a way I felt I need to test it and look what it's about. Julius Baer was a family owned back then private bank. About 2,000 employees. Very traditional, very close. So people are very close to each other. Everybody knew everybody within the departments. It was actually quite a good place to get to learn the industry a bit, meet people, learn the terminology, the words, and all that. But it's also a place where I learned that private banking was not going to be my future. It was fun. It was interesting. Again, I enjoyed the client interactions, and let's not forget this is Swiss private banking at its peak. So we're talking, full discretion, secrecy, etc. So you had to have a super level of maturity and professionalism from begin on, and I learned the ropes there very well. I started off also in the payments department, so that's just to set the baseline there, right? This is not day one. Here's a client, you deal with them. My first few days were spent entering payments into the system. But also what it did was ultimately, and that's for all of you out there who are worrying, should I do a middle office, back office job to get to know the industry? Do it. Because what you learn is a lot about how a bank works, just being able to understand what a SWIFT is, how payment system works, how matching works, all these kind of elements. These are very, very useful skills that help you understand the broader context always. And then as I worked through the cash desk there, so first payments, and then the payments people put me for a month at the main office on the main shopping street there, Bahnhofstrasse, on the cash desk. So literally, access to a treasurer, getting cash ready, all these kind of jobs, but also menial stuff, like filling up the cash machines, but it's all stuff that has to happen. And it was all great experiences to learn and do and learn a lot about processes. And then from there, I was moved into for 3 months as a kind of a backup assistant to the North American Far Eastern team, dealing with a high net worth individuals there that were banking offshore. Which obviously now has ended in Switzerland due to a significant pushback on that. But it was an interesting experience because, again, there we were ultimately operating.
For people who aren't familiar with what's happened, can you give a little bit of a history?
Sure.
For the younger audience.
Sure. Switzerland's always been a tax haven, obviously, in as far as tax avoidance, not tax dodging, so avoidance. Was seen as really a bad thing to do, or definitely not something criminal. And some banks have specialized or were able to help people, or would, let's put this very delicately, looked away from potentially some how clients made their money, and again how they were treated with the tax system. So all that came to more or less a fall in the mid 2000s and has now progressed into a completely different Swiss banking system, which is much more cautious about it, a lot more clarity around individuals, beneficial owners. So it's not too easy, for example, to just bring up a trust and say, we're not going to tell you who's behind the trust. You actually have to give beneficial owners out there. So when I started,
and this was just because initially people were just using it as a tax haven, a way to avoid taxes here in the U.S., everywhere, abroad, everywhere.
Well, again, it's the tax haven story, right? So people would have a numbered account, put the money into Switzerland, not declare it anywhere.
Right.
And again, the banks in Switzerland were just cautious, but we're not digging too much into that.
Right.
But
it paid them not to look too much into it for a long time, right? It's good to have that balance, right?
It's changed a lot, and I think a lot has to do obviously with the developments of the 2000s, right? Money streams, obviously.
Was there a certain kind of like foot that dropped at a certain date that was like that was it? That was the death of.
Obviously, now we're talking about banking history in Switzerland more than my career, but that was in those days, and I think I wouldn't say any of that was an impact, but I just realized what I dealt with was individuals ultimately, right? So people, high net worth individuals, it's one person's money, maybe their family's money, and it was personal. So I realized, I don't want to be part of that. I preferred the professional services that you offer when working investment banking, when you're working with institutional clients.
Did you know that? Did you know that when you were when you were working with the individuals, were you immediately like, oh, working with individuals is not so good. Let me go to investment banking or equity capital. Did you know that at the time?
I didn't really realize it too much. I think it was a sense for me that I didn't want to work necessarily with individuals. And so I progressed with my career. So I did my military service, came back to university. I was dabbling a bit with economics and business, and then started off my first job in brokerage. And again, in brokerage, I ended up in the middle office as a student job, 40, 50% after uni. And again, Switzerland's a bit different maybe than the US, but maybe closer to Germany or the UK, where you can actually do other jobs next to it because you can organize your time a bit better. So I'd spend 3-4 hours a day entering trades into the databases, into the systems, because back then not everything was electronic yet. So the salespeople would still fill in individual buy-sell sheets, hand them to the middle office, and we'll obviously process the trades and get everything set up for settlement. And again, there you learn a lot about the settlement system, you learn about the trading system, you have interaction with the middle offices at other trading houses, banks, etc. So a lot of good experience collected over the years. And then I did that for a year, and that team said, look, you're at Julius Baer again in the brokerage team. You're great. You should move into research. And then I transferred into research, where I spent the next 4 years really, working from, writing sections of reports, definitely working on all of the models, doing research for the analysts.
This is all while you're still in uni, though.
That's all while I'm at uni, which is obviously
10 hours a week, 20 hours. What are we talking here? To do all
We're talking, well, it depended. Obviously, in the summer breaks, that would be a full-time job. We're going in direction 50, 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
And during, the busy phases, obviously, it was back down to, 2-3 hours a day or 2 days a week, something like that. So I was paid 40%, and that was working around that level. So
you were paid, paid 40%.
No, for 40%. So full time, not a full time job, but 40% job ultimately.
And so is this typical to be at a firm kind of throughout your university? I mean, for 4 years, right? And I know you got a master's and stuff, but
yeah, well, it isn't a very typical thing, and obviously everything changes depending on Bologna and other, on the curricula you have. But I think the big question, I think maybe this is kind of the takeaway from this, because everybody's experience is different, but there is no merit in just pushing through directly with 3 years of university or 4 years of university if you have the opportunity to do other stuff on the side. So if you're doing, let's say, 20 points a semester, and somebody else does 30 points a semester, but you can do 20 points and work on the side, that's not necessarily a bad thing to do. At some point, people don't care how long you studied. At some point, people don't count up those years and say, hey, you should have done it in 3.5 or 4 years or 4.5, whatever, So, you yourself need to sort out, what works for you in that context. And for me, the practical experience is good. I ended up also switching my major. I moved into political sciences. I was struggling a bit with the exams in business and finance. Which is a bit shocking that obviously now today I work in this field. And to this day, obviously people still ask me, how did you end up as an archaeologist, in the business? But one way or the other, I think what you can't forget is again, uni is a great experience. It's an opportunity to learn something different. The Anglo-Saxon world always allows dabbling with different topics. It doesn't have to be business and finance, and allows yet still enough chances to be studying across different subjects. So you ultimately can mix, for example, history with economics and do something in economic history or something like that to build up.
Was this partly a financial consideration as well? Because you're earning 40% of a full time, it's helping fund your university. Because I mean, you're there.
Definitely.
You had I know in Europe it's different, but the master's, right? So it's typically done in 4 or 5 years, right?
Correct, 5 years into master,
And
and
you were there about 7, right?
yeah, exactly. So
Because you
I
were
started off.
working.
I was working. I started off with business and economics, so I lost
Right.
a year and a half on that one. I
Got it.
lost half a year doing my military service in Switzerland, which is compulsory.
Yep.
So you kind of add up all that together, and
There you go.
yeah, of course, there we go. It's 7 years is not a bad thing. I think the difference is clearly once you're finished, you come to your first job. You're most probably a bit older than your average grad, both in the US or in Europe. And again, banks have a wide range of acceptance when it comes to age. So 25, 26 is not an uncommon age for most of the Europeans to start. So most of the guys who were in my analyst class were, I'd say, from the European side, were on average 25, whereas the UK or US grads were obviously closer to 22, 23.
Right.
And that was a clear distinction at the start.
But tell me kind of the whole process of, so as you're approaching, you've
Sure.
had this equity research position or research assistant position for so many years. Tell me
Yeah.
a little bit about as you're finally approaching graduation or finally approaching the enough credits to be done
Yeah.
with your triple major. Tell me a little bit about just the recruiting process.
Sure.
Were you thinking, hey, I'm going to go full time in equity research?
Yeah, that was definitely one thing. I was obviously thinking my employer would give me a full-time job. I had a famous chat with the boss there, and I said, "Listen, so what are we going to do with me? You know, I'm done with my university." The guy turned around and said to me, "What do you mean with that?" And I was thinking, "Oh, so you're not thinking about hiring me full time?" And the answer was something along the lines of, "What were you thinking?" And so
Why would we do that kind of?
why would we do that? Correct. So I was shocked about that. Obviously, you spend so much time and all that, but it was a good life lesson, and I'd never forget my boss back then, the analyst who covered healthcare, and I'll never forget her words, because she said, "You know what? That could be a blessing in disguise, because you do not have to take a decision here. Somebody has taken the decision for you. You know where you are. That means you can move on, right?"
Yeah.
And I'll never forget that, because obviously disappointment was big, and so I started going into the interview process. The interview process is interesting because obviously in Germany, Switzerland, typically if you don't have a business or finance degree, a lot of people question why. They don't look necessarily at the job experience, and vice versa.
How'd you even get the interviews? I guess that internship did help, obviously.
Exactly. People were looking at it and saying, "Look, you were a full or half partial part-time employee, so you definitely built up some knowledge base." But then decisions were taken, and typically went for grads with a finance degree, but maybe less experience. My experience though with the London, New York banks, was much more positive. So I put forward, I think January. So I wasn't even fully aware about the interview cycles. Patrick, your website didn't exist yet, so there was no chance to really dig into all
I think
of that
we just
information.
started. I think we just 15 years ago. It was like, oh, say we were tiny. Yeah.
At a point in time where it was hard, where nobody really knew what to look for.
Yeah.
Because definitely I heard about you guys the first time when I actually got to the analyst training, and we were checking out some of the forum at that point. But look, no, I didn't see much information, didn't understand the whole hiring cycles and all that. And then they were looking off cycle for a analyst in the equity capital markets team with German language skills. I fit the mold perfectly at Citi. It was literally my first, I think, application and interview. And at the same time, Deutsche was looking also for, I think, a FIG analyst. And I applied for that one as well. I was invited to interview for both, but I had the Citi one, I think, a week before the other. So I did my telephone interviews with the head of German ECM back then, and then invited for the Super Day and individual interviews also with the head of ECM and the co-head of Northern Europe, etc. So that happened relatively quickly. So I even got to the point where I was offered a job by Citi before I had a chance even to go to the Deutsche interview, at which point I just said, "Look, I got an American bank, I got an offer, I'm happy with it. It's an equity capital markets," which I've all done all of my career basically in equities, so it's a place I feel comfortable in.
That
The
was in
debt
that was in
broke.
the London office, correct?
That was in the London office, correct? Yeah, and then hired directly to start in the analyst class of 2007, which was an interesting experience, and I'll come to that again. Being an off cycle means you weren't in the previous intern class.
Hmm.
That means you didn't know the people from the previous internship class, the summer analysts of 2006. You didn't know the institution, you didn't know anybody there apart from the people you interviewed with. So getting into the analyst class really was that great icebreaker day one. Here are 100 other analysts, and we were 100 in
Yeah.
2007
Yeah.
in Citi's summer
Before
analyst
everything
class.
cratered, but yeah.
Correct. And then got to meet a bunch of people from all over the world, and that was, I think, one of the really truly most inspiring experiences of my life. A lot of people say that, but it made a big impact, because suddenly there are 100 people with you, 5-6 weeks, all of you starting at the same time. Everybody else is starting in London. Everybody embarking basically on their careers. Yes, there's lots of partying going on the first few weeks, which is obviously good. But there's also some true, social bonding then that these are people that you will see repeatedly through your careers. And which if you
A lot
are
a lot of training. So you guys are stuck in the classroom together, but then you go out after. Yeah.
exactly, and listen, you had a project in the last week where you spend your first all-nighter at work, which is really fun and weird, but if you've never done it before, and obviously the summer analysts from the previous year did so, but it was a great experience, obviously, to start realizing, okay, I'm part of this now. Now we work all together, and you know what? You're not the only one there at 4 o'clock in the morning finishing a book. So all that things came together in the first week, and it was a great experience. So
Did you know you were, sorry to interrupt, did you know you were going ECM, right? Did they already?
yes, yeah, I was a direct hire for ECM,
Was
directly even
that
for
typical? Is that typical, or
so it was unique, I think, because they were looking for somebody specific. They were typically looking for roughly 5 or 6 analysts and per year back then. And in this case, there was a clear request for a German-speaking analyst to join the team, and I was lucky enough to fall into that. I would say today's practice is more. Citi changed a lot after that, so they merged the ECM, DCM, left-fin teams into capital markets origination, and then from about 2009 onwards until about now. To be honest, I'm not too sure exactly what the latest developments are, but until now, everything was hired, for capital markets directly, and then you rotated within capital markets. So that was definitely a change in hiring.
So you're hired. You didn't have the summer internship before, but you still felt like you bonded with a lot of your fellow and new analysts. Tell me a little bit about those first few months on the job in terms of. Was it an immediate ramp up of long hours, or was it you feel like, given you were a little more seasoned, you could handle it? Or tell me a little bit about that whole transition for you, because you were a little older, right, than some of them.
Yeah, well, yes, I'd say so. Yeah, I'd say on a slightly one of the older ones in the class, but not the oldest, definitely. So, but I think there are two elements I think that come out of it. Number one, was I used to working late? Yes, from university, definitely. That's the thing I thrived at. Excelled at that pushing through the night and working on a report, on a paper, something like that for universities. And to be honest, I'm a bit of a last minute person, so it would be most of my fault for that. But that's a separate debate. Number two, I think the ramp up or the shock, I expected it, and I think the key message there is, you're coming into this industry, there is automatically kind of an expectation of long hours, long work, and not necessarily because something's inefficient, just because it's the way we work together. So you have multiple teams on transaction, multiple teams on pitches. Everybody needs to go through their own cycles, finish paperwork, multiple hierarchies to go through, people to sign off on the elements, and it just takes its time. And I think in reality, yes, it would be great if we're all done at midnight. Typically, that's just not always the case. And I think, in my first week, clearly until IT worked, I was out by 7. And I think from my second week on, I was pushing past dinner into the midnight hours, grabbing a cab around, midnight, 12:30 on average. And then the first few already, 2, 3 o'clocks in the morning that came around soon afterwards. But again, I think the one factor that changes that is, the banter, the camaraderie of everybody being there at the same time, which is clearly an experience people don't have in today's world, right? We're all in some people call it bullpen. Basically, the desks are there for the analysts, and you'd see other people are there. You don't feel alone. And I think today's world, where obviously everybody's stuck at home, on Zooms or not, or just emails, you feel much more isolated from all that. So every time you do see, seniors in Wall Street comment of getting people back to work, yeah, there's clearly an element there of that.
Yeah, we've seen work from home be pretty dramatic negative impact on everyone's psyche, including the analysts and associates. And this is the survey we conducted, I think a month ago or two, kind of piggybacking off what the 13 analysts did at Goldman, illustrated that it was bad, especially for first years, not as much for second years because they had that relationship.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see how this summer goes and what the difference is based on like some that are still virtual versus not. But
exactly.
So you're ramped up quickly. Tell me a little bit about how things progressed through your first kind of few years, and then did you know you were going to stay on? After working so many hours in your analyst years, was ECM like a pretty rigorous team? Were you guys doing? I mean, I assume you were super busy, but just give me a little bit about. Great financial crisis happened, so that's scary at a certain point.
That was, I think, that was definitely a surprise. So, looking back, I think, admittedly, I didn't really get what was coming. And back in 2007. You'd look at some strategy reports. People are talking about credit crunch, tightening of credit, and then in the beginning of 2008, Bear Stearns collapsed and was sold to I think JP back then for, I think it was initially first $1 and then it went for $6. And I think there was quite a big shock. People would say, "Oh my God, that's the start of a proper crisis." And as a first year analyst, you just look at it and go like, really? I mean, is it that bad? Everything seems to be still working. And then through the summer, it became clear something serious was going on. And I do remember, obviously, I think it was September 15 in 2008, looking across the street to Lehman, seeing people come out, people in meeting rooms across the street. And then we were in our own meeting room talking about, what this means. And clearly, the message was, be there for your clients, be smart, learn a lot, and share that information. And so during that time, I was much more of a sponge rather than doing a lot. Clearly, the IPO market was closed. Markets were partially in free fall. And we were starting to already look at what the impact would be for a lot of the banks in Europe and covering Germany, Switzerland, Austria. There was a big focus on clearly what was happening in Germany, what was impacting the Swiss banks, and just really trying to keep up with some of the latest news around that.
Did you think that there would be cuts coming through to the analyst level at all, or were there cuts? I assume there were some cuts, or no?
Yeah, so I think back in September, I think people were still unclear, and I think there were some weekends you felt you're not sure if, the bank itself would be impacted or not. So a lot of news happened on the weekends, clearly, because that was the only time markets were closed and a lot of decision makers could just really work through that. And then at some point, clearly the news came through, cuts were going to happen. And then back in, I think it was about November, the rumor mill turned into redundancies will happen. And then I think it was the beginning of December when these were announced. And that was some really dark days there, because they were, I think, 25 or 30% of the teams cut, huge cuts, and really significant, really impact on the floor. and people being just called on their desk, said, come to the meeting room, and sorry to let you go kind of situations. Our Christmas party was relatively dark then, and I remember clearly there was nothing done externally, and it was organized by one of the senior MDs in his place, which was actually a very nice touch, just to make a point about, this is about holding together and being part of a family, almost, rather than just canceling completely. So but then dark days also mean sometimes opportunities. The team structure changed. I was basically now working directly with an MD. And that obviously gave me a lot of opportunity too, because now between me and the MD, there were no people in between, meant I had to be associate, VP, and director, as well as analyst at the same time.
Luckily, you were a little bit older. You were ready for it. No,
I was ready for it. Exactly.
You're only a year in, right, when this all happened.
I was a year in, and that was obviously around 1.5 years in now when everything changed a bit.
Right.
But that still meant put your sleeves up and start working. And
were bonuses just completely just zeros across the board?
No. They were there. Obviously, analysts are always taken care of. It's not something. At the end of the day, it's a small amount for analysts to worry about. So they weren't really affected. Yes, of course, numbers were down.
Do you remember around what it was?
Yeah, I do. I think in my first year it was. But then again, the bases were also much lower. So your listeners should look at T-comp numbers.
Yeah, what was the? Yeah, I mean, if inflation too, right? But what was the base?
So I think the base was, I started with 36 pounds, 36,000 pounds.
Yep.
And I think I made a 35 or 36 bonus in the first year, so about 72 or something.
Almost like 100% bonus.
100%. So that was a top performer first year.
That's amazing.
Second year was a top performer, and I think it went up from 36 to like 40 or 45, and then made, I think it was about 25 or 28, something like that.
Yeah, so it went down, even though
it went down
just because of the crisis.
Exactly. So it was definitely a fraction of the.
But the fact that you've kept your job and you now have all this opportunity, it's not necessarily a direct personal hit to you.
Exactly, and again, you're as an analyst, let's be honest, the money you're getting is good. You can't fault it. It is you got a flat. You're gonna you got a job. You're feeding yourself. You got your dinners at work anyway.
Yeah.
You don't have much overhead, so it's not a big problem. And I think that's the other thing to just remember around this. It's at the beginning, it's not the money game at the beginning.
Of course,
always look to the later years. And yes, the opportunity was there. So if somebody asked me, would you want to change at that point in time, or because everything had changed? No, now was the opportunity to grab chance to be much more beyond what I was working at. I was an analyst too, and now I could be an associate or VP kind of a character, lead executions directly. And I grabbed that opportunity, and my MD,
you started doing that right away.
Correct. And my MD was supportive there as well, mentoring, helping me. Clearly, he also had to roll up his sleeves. But then again, we're in the middle of one of the worst crises ever. So he was in most probably a very similar mode, happy he was still there. Everything was working out and he could push on. So, it was just a kind of get it done kind of attitude, which was great.
Did your hours kind of go up after those cuts, or do you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was an element of clearly less business in equity capital markets because initially the IPO work obviously came to a complete standstill. Yeah. But then in Europe, we do a lot of rights issue work, recap work for all of the banks, recap work for some of bigger corporates who.
Can you explain what recap work is to people who don't?
Sure. Well, recaps are recapitalizations. So you're basically reestablishing the equity base, raising equity capital in big size. So one of the larger transactions we did was actually for Volkswagen, VW. Back then, are you talking about like secondary offerings and stuff? Secondary offering, that's correct.
Yeah,
so typically in Europe, there are two ways to do it. You do an accelerated overnight offering, and you do it in a quick accelerated book build. One of the first transactions I worked on was actually that one was a 1.5 billion M&A financing done for Conti Continental, the German auto supplier, when they bought Siemens VDO business.
Okay.
Raised 1.5 billion euros in about 40 minutes, which back in 2007 was obviously a great transaction at the right point in time.
Yep.
Later, we did a lot more work around rights issues. So rights issues are basically a very typical structure in Europe where where every existing shareholder has a preemptive right to purchase a new share at a cheap price. These are obviously great arbitrage opportunities for hedge funds, so that's why they love them. You can go short and then cover yourself in the rights issue, either with cheap rights or actually new shares. So these transactions have kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, work out extremely well. And then also some more funky structures. So in 2010, as mentioned, we were helping Volkswagen unravel the Volkswagen Porsche structure. Back then, I mean, your listeners will be more familiar with the short squeeze on GameStop, but back then, 2010, that's the original short squeeze when Volkswagen was one of the most valuable companies in the world. When Porsche attempted to do a takeover that didn't really work out with I'm looking for the correct word. I mean, it's basic contracts for differences, but total return swaps, TSRs. So derivative structure that gave them Porsche nearly 30% of the shares in Volkswagen that had to be unraveled. So that required a special structure, a rights issue. Volkswagen was also restructuring themselves to both shoulder, the attempted takeover as well as a new strategy, a multi-brand strategy. Basically, the Volkswagen of today that we're very familiar with Audi and Lamborghini and Porsche in between the mix. That was basically founded in those days when they had to really kind of reconfigure the business. So so a lot of the work in the years afterwards was recaps, and then 2010, 2011, I also did a big capital increase for Commerzbank. Did a lot of work advising them. Also, obviously on an associate analyst level. I'm not trying to take here any thunder. So a lot of it, my work is predominantly actually preparing the pitch books and the advisory books rather than actually talking. But clearly, lots of opportunity to meet clients, learn about the clients, and especially on the working level, also connect with them. So from there, you learn a lot. And look, I think
how did things shift though? I mean, that's year 4, year 5. Are you still just the only one working with the same exact person?
Correct. Yeah. So obviously now there's analysts below me, there's interns below me, and obviously you start training them up and getting them going. And it's the magic element. The better you train up your interns and analysts, the quicker you can focus on other stuff than basically checking spreadsheets and market reports, etc. So that's a big element part, and that's actually also kind of why I'm doing this, Patrick, right? Because I do want to. I think I've always enjoyed doing recruiting. I've doing talking about the job, highlighting some of the realities rather than just the marketing speak. Because I think it is an extremely fulfilling career. It's an absolutely fun job. So much diversity in it, and change every single day. But it's not all like written on all of our recruitment posters, because there are some hours you are 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning, and you need to kick yourself and say the book needs to be done in an hour. Look, fight through the tiredness, fatigue, get there and get it done with. And sometimes you get called in on a Saturday or Sunday into work, and back then there were no such thing like protected weekends. And you'd be there on a Saturday afternoon after somebody said, "Listen, can you take care of a market update for me in the next 2-3 hours?" And that was just natural and normal.
You feel like it became a little bit better, so you're going 80 plus, 90 plus hour weeks.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it was starting to get better.
You had some analysts under you,
but
better.
But it still would be some very long nights, obviously, because you're still there. And I always took the approach that if an analyst in the office and it's not and then, there's some supervision, support, guidance need. It's better if I'm there than if it's just sitting at home, working on a BlackBerry, because it's more direct, it's more immediate, and then, clarity was there. So
you
that was
moved
all of
up.
those
Eventually, you
developments.
became director. The
Correct. So
VP. Tell me about the progression in terms of.
yeah,
I'd love to hear progression in terms of just like years it took for each.
sure.
For title change, not that it necessarily changed what you were doing day to day right away, but then also specifically how managing people became. Was it like you said? It sounds like you're pretty hands on, like you were there with them in the trenches, which is great. And then specifically, tell me a little bit about if you can share ranges of pay. It doesn't have to be exact, but just in terms of like where you saw the big jumps.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think so I started in 2007. I got promoted to analyst, to associate in 2010 in the summer. Back then we had a summer to summer cycle for the analyst classes, and then you'd get promoted to associate, go to New York for training for a week, which was an absolute, brilliant week, clearly. Because all of us from London were typically 3 years into the job, veterans, and we get into these auditoria filled with fresh grads from business schools coming in with MBAs, but first job, being associate. And there was a definitely change in mentality. A lot of us saw it as a week of holidays. And for a lot of the MBAs, it was a chance of, kicking off the first job. Great, new experience. So let's just say the London kids were typically we were in the back row, and the ones that HR was trying to make sure that we showed up in the morning in a more or less presentable state. Mm-hmm. I'll never forget, one of my guys in the class ran out of fresh T-shirts and ended up walking around the last few days with a big fat, I love New York tourist T-shirt. Awesome. That was some really good days. So promotion after that, half a year, you're kind of a stub year, and then you move into the kind of year-end January to January cycle. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest jump for me was definitely at associate level, where you have a real big jump. You have 2 cash payments, basically. You have the summer bonus, which you get for working hard in your third year.
Yep.
Exactly. And then you get paid a stub, which was about £30,000
for that next half year.
For the next half year, with absolutely, kind of no kind of a performance kind of thing around it. And then you moved on to analyst associate progression. And again, I think there you go from, let's say, about 100 to 150 relatively quickly. Pounds again, T-comp.
Yeah.
Again, roughly, and again, these numbers might be slightly different in today's world.
They're
I'm not too sure.
Higher now, but not.
Yeah. but
then from there, VP, was there another probably not as big a jump in base necessarily, but potentially bonus, I assume.
But again, both start just progressing up continuously. And VP definitely were some of the clear better years also, because in your career, that's basically when you have a lot of skills, mm-hmm. But a lot less focus on P&L and delivery, and you're in a stage where obviously very focused on retention as you progress towards director level. And then director, I guess, you're a lot more in competition with the other directors directly. So once you hit director, there's no more kind of director 1, 2, 3, 4 in a pay grade perspective, because you're basically competing with the potential next MD as a director, and therefore, you're being compared like that.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a good thing, but that obviously is the most significant step. And I'd say when all switches between the levels were relatively straightforward, almost mechanic, until I got to director. That's where really now, I think it used to be MD, where it was, when I started, people said analyst to associate and director to MD are the 2 complicated ones. Everything in between is mechanic.
Yeah.
I think it's changed as far as it's now a lot more under review. People are much more mobile. There's a lot more looking. Is there, potential really good talent that you want to move quicker through the ranks, and vice versa. Or
it's not as structured now. They're actually looking at the individual and saying, hey, should we accelerate this person so we don't lose them?
Or vice versa. Should we hold somebody back because maybe something's missing there? Which is an interesting difference, because I think some of us still have the mentality you have to move on, otherwise it doesn't really work out. And at the same time, it just doesn't, happen at the same pace like it used to be.
So you mentioned P&L. Tell me about in terms of like equity capital markets. What is that? That obviously means like bringing in your own business. But how did were you starting that a little bit as a VP? I mean, obviously you're getting a ton of client interaction at that point.
Right.
Are the MDs like letting you handle some of that, or is it more like, hey, you have to go drum up your own business? And how do you even do that?
No. I think it's obviously at a larger institution, a bulge bracket like Citi. You're not looking at something where a VP is forced to step out every single day and say, what did you do with your clients? You're building up long-term relationships. If you execute a deal for a private equity house, you will know the people there. You'll be the principal or potentially even the partner if you're lucky, but you have enough interaction. And they will remember you. So when the next pitch comes around and you're on the page, somebody will say, oh, look, I know that person. I remember that was great execution. That deal worked out very nicely for us. That's how it comes together. And yes, obviously, the request is be out there, think about it. What kind of business can we? You're expected today as a, let's say, VP associate to start being smart and start thinking about originating deals as well. Doesn't mean necessarily, you have the link to the senior partner, because realistically you won't have it. It's more a question of, are you part of the origination effort? Are you keeping up to speed? Are you asking your MD, VP, director, whoever's above you, hey, have you actually checked out the situation recently? Or, hey, this is news flow, send it around the team, guys, should we do something here?
But you're not actually they're not giving you a team or any resources to actually do anything until you're, as a director, maybe.
As a director, correct, yeah.
But as a VP, it's less common that they're giving you any sort of analyst resources or anything.
I would do the analyst resources there, but you're kind of more in an interaction of, we're working together on something rather than a reporting line almost kind of situation. Yeah.
Yeah, fair. Okay. So and then pay up into director, I assume the bonuses get really big, which is great. So yeah, I'd love to just hear about that kind of final stage for you. How was it? Was it difficult for you? I mean, because you sounded like you were pretty hands-on and liked the operational kind of aspect of nature.
Well, I think that everybody has their own style, and everybody should develop their own style. You need to know what you like. I always try to be very hand-on with down to the analysts, trying to understand what's going on. Other people are more, some of my other peers are much more, handed off to a VP or associate. Potentially not there. I think there's always a benefit in a team understanding what's going on every down to every junior understanding what are we trying to achieve. It's not always possible because everybody's super busy and people are sometimes extremely underwater. Mm-hmm. But ultimately that is the goal, that every last person in the team should understand what their role is. And you're maybe not picking up the phone to CEO, CFO, and I'm not doing that either. But and even as an analyst, you're valuable input in getting something done, no matter what, because you're a resource. You're supporting an overall effort and making sure, for example, a pitch book is still putting thoughts on the piece of paper, right? It is a sales material. It is the product ultimately of the analyst to produce a pitch book. And that is such an important element of the marketing effort of a bulge bracket bank.
I don't want to keep you around too much longer, but one thing that kind of strikes me is just it's super rare nowadays to see a run like yours of over a decade at one firm. Do you feel like things are changing? Like that's going to be much more rare, even more rare going forward, or do you feel like there's still going to be people like you that kind of come up through the ranks? And any specific thoughts of why you stuck around so much? I mean, maybe it was timing, and that kind of middle ranks kind of opened up because of the great financial crisis, and it was the perfect kind of runway. But I would love to just hear your perspective on that.
Sure. Do I think it's more uncommon? I don't think so necessarily. I know a number of people across the organization that have been there. Yeah, I would say from the people who started off, the 100 people in my first analyst class, the 70 in my associate class, there aren't many there. But one of the guys, our head of syndicate at Citi right now in Europe was my analyst class. We started off together. So 5%, 6%, maybe 10% are still within the organization somewhere. And it has lots of reasons, right? Personal reasons. Some people leave the industry just because they've had it, or they have a different opportunity, or they'd like to move to something completely different. Some do it consciously on health reasons, clearly, right? Which is something you people just do nowadays, and it's fine. We had people leaving after 1 year, just saying it's just not my thing. And to be honest, it's great to see that kind of honesty, self-honesty, just saying, look, I just can't. I don't want to do it. It's not what I feel happy with. Others obviously take exit opportunities, be it into the hedge fund or private equity world. I don't think there's just one path through it, and I think sometimes what's dangerous is a kind of an expectation. There is no you do 2 years of this, 2 years of that, and then you end up afterwards at Blackstone or KKR or something like that. They're not waiting for you, right? So ultimately, it's about doing the right things for yourself as you progress with it. And for me, one of the things was I never felt urged or in too much, too strongly about moving ship, right? Because it would be different place, more or less the same people you anyway deal with. Slightly more pay, maybe a year quicker, but up the ranks. But at the end of the day, I felt comfortable, and I like the organization. I love Citi. I mean, it's a great place. Got a great career out of it, and met a lot of people, and that's ultimately what was important for me.
Yeah,
so
it actually takes a lot of confidence to do that, because oftentimes people will jump, but you can end up rocking the boat and actually you think it's better over in the other area in that specific group, you go there, and then suddenly your boss ends up being worse or whatnot. Or you get more demanding, it becomes more demanding, or worse, they don't view you as positively. You don't know what the dynamics are going to be like, or the policy.
It can go in all different directions, right? I think the most important thing is, and the other thing is, obviously I had a great mentor with the MD that I was working with.
Exactly.
He's now the head of ECM at one of the European banks. Wow. I didn't follow him, but I had an immense amount I learned from him. Super grateful what he did, and ultimately, I felt really comfortable. I just thought I can't change that, right? So I had a boss
was the move for you, and you don't have to share if you're not comfortable. There's the move, you don't have to say where you're going, but was the move for you kind of the start of the process of kind of starting to look, was it more around losing that mentor?
No, not necessarily. I think it's also just getting my own feet. There's a number of personal issues to moving geographically. So it all comes together. And again, it was the right thing to do for me to start to change my position and move on. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, really, a conscious decision and looking forward to the future. So that's
similar roles. It's just going to be a similar role somewhere else.
It's going to be a similar role, exactly.
Okay. Very cool. So you
more to follow on my LinkedIn at some point.
For sure. No, we appreciate that. Anything else before we call it? Anything else? Any other words of wisdom you'd like to share for the younger audience, kind of looking at their?
So I typically I have 2 or 3 things, do's and don'ts, maybe that I've picked up over the years, and it starts off with the whole topic of how do you reach out on LinkedIn to people and ask questions, which is, by the way, not a bad thing, but I wouldn't expect too much of a positive reaction to that, because a lot of people just ignore it or just don't respond, so you feel bad about it. Number 2, sometimes the approaches are so badly fumbled. I mean, people just reach out, send me a CV and say, please review. It's like, that's not my job. I've got a day job. It's I need to do banking business.
I get that a lot. Sometimes see people like, please review.
Yeah, exactly.
Give me feedback. And sometimes if there's a certain message along with it that makes sense, I will
I agree, but just consider. I mean, we all have real jobs out there, and as much as we're approachable, maybe on LinkedIn, it seems so. That's not networking. Networking really, what makes a difference is go to the recruitment events, because if I go somewhere, I've taken out consciously half a day or day to spend time with students and potential recruits, make an impact. Don't talk about, first question should not be how can I shortcut? Can I become an associate tomorrow? No. There are set targets by the banks. The recruitment process are relatively firm in that sense. If you're an undergrad, you're going to end up an analyst. If you've got an MBA, you become an associate. It is what it is. You know what? You're 2 years of 3 years of hard work, and you'll be at the same position without a business school or a debt or anything like that. So that's something positive to look forward to. At least in Europe. I'm aware US is slightly different.
Yeah.
Then prepare yourself for interviews, right? There's nothing worse than having people come in not 100% sure what Citi does, for example, or potentially even saying, "Oh, I've been to 20 other banks." That's great. I know you're going to interview other banks. It's fine, but at least give me the illusion that you've just come for this one here today. What's very important is, as interviewer, I don't spend much time, obviously, looking at the CVs because I've always been working. So make sure you have a 1-minute pitch. When you start, you should be able to talk immediately who you are, why you're here, what's the key things, and we can dive into all the other things. Be interesting. I think that's an important tip. I got hired at Citi on the basis of being able to talk about my archaeology degree. So the extracurricular can be a way to connect with your interviewer in an extremely good way, which means please don't come up with crazy stuff, but everybody is the chairman or chairwoman at their finance club. And then if you talk to me about the finance club investing in Apple or Tesla, that's too standard. Talk about some really interesting and show why you're brilliant and all that. And last but not least, don't take a rejection as a disappointing point or anything. Move on. You know what? In the business, you'll have lots of times you're going to lose a pitch, and you're going to have to just create the next pitch book for the next day, because that's how the business works. So if you're struggling to deal with rejection at the start, you're never going to be a good banker.
For sure. I love that, Chris. Thanks so much for your time and sharing all your wisdom.
Sure.
And good luck with your next step.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Hear you soon.
And thanks to you, my listeners at Wall Street Oasis. If you have any suggestions whatsoever, please don't hesitate to send them my way, patrick@wallstreetoasis.com. Until next time.